Hey there, my friends. Welcome back to the Logistics Life. Today on Data Day, we're going to talk seasonality. I think it's going to be, Dean, a little bit of a break from the norm, if you will. This is one conversation, brother, that we really haven't
Yeah.
got into very much lately. We've been talking about, markets and everything and when's stuff going to pick up. But
Mm.
what is happening on the seasonality side? What is happening on some of the products, maybe even produce season? Let's dive into that a bit.
Yeah, the seasonality piece is interesting. We're not seeing it in terms of the volume, right, on the demand side. So we've talked about a flat market for months now, and that certainly hasn't changed. Produce volumes are on par with last year, down slightly, but we've still got a few weeks to go before the July 4 peak, which is, we've always got to wait until after Independence Day to assess really what happened during the annual event that drives up spot rates, right? So spot rates for dry van and reefer typically go up on July 4. You see this peak and then it comes down. So the last few years, it's been fairly flat, more like a speed bump rather than a peak in spot rates. So when you look at where spot rates are today, and this is a function of not higher demand but decreased capacity as carriers have exited the industry, it looks like we might see a typical seasonal peak in spot rates this year, but not because demand is higher, but because capacity is tighter.
Okay.
Right. So when you look at the numbers, when you look at where spot rates are on our chart, our graph of rates, we can see that produce. I think rates are going to go up in the order of maybe 25 cents a mile from. Remember, we talk about produce season as sort of Vidalia onion pack date, middle of April to July 4. That's really
Yes.
produce season from a meaningful truckload volume perspective. So, we had a bump around Mother's Day, big bump in volume there, and the rates kind of went up and stayed there as a plateau, which was unusual because normally they go up and come down. And then during June, they kind of take off up until 7.4. Well, reefer rates went up around Mother's Day and they kind of stayed flat for a good period of time. And they're still kind of flat to up. But I think by the time we get to July 4, we are going to see a very typical seasonal peak in the order of 25 cents a mile between April 15 and July 4, which is great news from a rate seasonality perspective. It just means, though, that volumes are nowhere near where they were last year. They're down 6% according to the USDA today, 6% volume. And the part of the reason is that California is down 9% compared to last year, and it's the big producer of truckload volume. So from a seasonality perspective, Dan, we are seeing a bit of a lift in rates, which means carriers are doing a little bit better. It means brokers have found it harder to find carriers to move those specialty loads. And I think also when you see some of these specialty crops come online, like cherries out of the Pacific Northwest, they're in the middle of their season. Those sorts of loads command a premium. Transit times, they don't ripen on the tree. Like you've got to get them to market really quickly. High value commodities, there's a limited number of carriers that can haul that type of commodity. So that's the good news on the rate front is we're starting to see rates bottom out to tightening. Right? I've got to be careful with my words here. Because rates have been at the bottom of this trough. So spot rates in dry van have been negative year over year for 27 months.
Wow.
In April of 2022, spot rates went negative year over year, which kind of defines when you start a freight recession, right? So normally they're in the 17 to 23 month range. We're at 27 months. And it's interesting that we almost went year over year positive in June so far. We still may go year over year positive in June by the time we get to the end of the month. That'll be 27 months of negative year over year rates, which tells you how elongated this trough has been and how soft this market has been and how oversupplied this market has been. And that's what's different about this cycle. We don't see much change in that scenario for the rest of the year, even though Derek Leathers came out yesterday, head of CEO of Werner, and started to talk about the market cycle turning. And he was talking about, rates starting to move up. he was talking about, this is something you'll know about, Dan, less churn. So less churn in RFPs was the thing that he said he was noticing. Even though there was this constant drive for shippers to drive rates lower, he was seeing less churn. And I guess churn in your capacity providing world means shippers changing carriers.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So he was
Mm-hmm.
his key comment was seeing a lot less churn. So there's some market pundits out there that are talking about the market turning, which is really interesting. We haven't seen that kind of language in a while, but rest assured, we expect to see more rate increases between now and July 4. So there's definitely a sense that the market is showing signs of tightening. What it does beyond um, July 4 is another story, right? Because normally
Mm-hmm.
rates taper off pretty quickly. I'm just trying to see. I'm looking at the USDA report today. They have a thing called a truck availability report, and what they do is they look at how many trucks are available in the market. They look at how many brokers are reporting a shortage of trucks in each market. Last week, there was an adequate supply in all 19 produce markets. There was a slight surplus in the Yakima Valley in Washington, and there was a surplus of trucks across Mexico through southern Texas, which is really interesting, Dan, because the USDA just put a pause on inspecting avocados and mangoes because of some security scare with USDA workers. They actually put a pause on them, which will slow down imports even more at a peak time in their season. Mexico volumes are currently down 12% year over year. So that could worsen
Wow.
the situation, right? And that could lower truckload volumes out of South Texas at a time of the year we normally start to see some meaningful volumes. This time last year, the USDA was reporting two markets had tight capacity or slight shortage. So this year, no produce market had any shortage of equipment, right, which fits the market that we see. Last year, Central and South Florida and South Carolina had a slight shortage of trucks. So, and that's for watermelons, and you start to get into peach season and all of those products that come out of the Tifton market, all those vegetables. So there's a still loose capacity across the market when you look at all of the produce markets, but there is a sense that things are starting to tighten when you look at some of the individual markets that are pushing out meaningful produce volumes, like the West Coast, for example. When you look at reefer rates out of the West Coast, like you look at the big market like Fresno, rates are up 4 cents a mile last week, even though volumes were down. It's interesting. Whenever you look at a market and see rates up, volumes down, right, you have to say capacity's tightened because there's fewer trucks available. To my earlier point, what you're seeing there is that rates are they're about up 12 cents a mile in the last month, which again fits that produce season narrative that we've been talking about. Out of Fresno, Dan, this is really interesting. Fresno is the big market that pushes produce out of the West Coast. Rates are up 11 cents a mile last week on 8% lower volume of loads. So that gives you a sense of how hard it is for some brokers to find capacity in some markets, right? Even though there's a glut of capacity nationally, most freight doesn't move nationally, it moves regionally and sort of market to market. And that's why we're seeing some markets with pretty good rate movement, but tight capacity for brokers trying to find trucks.
So, Dean, I got a couple of questions for you. So as you were sharing all that information, I started to really dive deep into one is we know that the freight market, the lower volume of freight, has a lot to do with the economic economy, shippers getting a lot smarter during COVID as to how they ship and all this kind of stuff,
Yep.
right? That's now kind of dovetailed into what we're seeing today.
Yep.
But when it comes to produce, we're talking about pretty much no strained capacity in all the produce markets. Is that because there's more trucks, or do you see that as more of or maybe a mix of the two? Do you see that as more of produce volumes are down by 12%, 12, and especially Mexico by what it was, 16% or whatever, and then 9 to 12% on East and West?
Yeah.
Would that volume equate to where we would normally struggle with equipment?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not normally. No, no.
Okay.
Normally, but I think produce when you get into specialized equipment, it's very different. Like it's like drop deck flatbeds. It's like refrigerated trailers with multi temp zones, right?
Yes.
When you start to get into specialized equipment, I think capacity can tighten very quickly, and especially when it comes to certain commodities that require the white glove treatment. And I
Yeah, it's
think a
like
lot of
shipping hazmat today.
yeah,
There,
I think a
there's
lot of people
so
think a
many
truck
less carriers that haul hazmat these
right.
days.
And I just think a lot of people in the market think a truck is a truck is a truck. And that's far from it when it comes to produce. So think about produce. You've got multiple pickups per load. You know, you've got your 150 air mile exemption where your ELDs don't turn on. You know, you're under the personal, you're under what's the personal conveyance, I think it is, where you can do 10 pickups within 150 miles to get a full load of produce from, you know, California to New York City and essentially not record any hours, right? That's what that ag haulers
Mm.
exemption means. So to do that though, there has to be a premium for that. That costs money, even though you're not recording hours. It costs money to do that, and that's why you've got to be the right sort of carrier that can handle that. Firstly, you've got to have the right equipment. You've got to have we talked about on the show before. We've got some of our brokers that won't load a truck with a refrigerated motor that's over 3 years of age. So you've got to
Hmm.
run really new equipment. And then on top of that, Dan, you've got to be able to run miles. I can't tell you how hard it is to run market freight. We call it market freight. But market freight means it's time sensitive. You've got to make sure your refrigeration motor is running properly. It's at the set point, it holds there. You're not icing up the lettuce and the top of the load. Like you've got everything, you've got a clean floor, and you're in on time. And the longer the distance, the harder that is to do. And it takes a real professional to do that. So that's the deal with produce. It commands a premium, rates are higher, capacity gets tighter when you get into this sort of market. And I also think when you've got a bit of excess capacity, you on the sourcing side can be more selective about who you
Yes.
use. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that's where we kind of sit there. A little bit of seasonality in rates. We expect to see a little bit more lift in rates over the period. Our rates are sitting now. We're seeing dry van rates go up a little bit. They won't go up nearly as much as refrigerated rates. They're sitting. We've got rates sitting right now. If I exclude fuel, we've got dry van at 166. We've got reefer at 197, 198. We've got flatbed sitting at 208, but the projection has got flatbed rates coming down, which again is seasonally normal. Once you get to the first half of the year, once you get the first half of the year out of the way, produce flatbed rates start to drop. So again, seasonality is starting to emerge in the flatbed market. Why? We are past construction season, planting season, nursery season, farm machinery import season. We're seeing some warning signs on the machinery market. Dan, I don't know if you saw the news this week that John Deere have announced a layoff of staff, fairly significant layoff of staff. Um, the volume of tractor sales is 30% lower than the 5 year average. So there's a sign that, and I don't know if you listened to Meet Me for Coffee yesterday, that big freight market update yesterday. Jason Miller and others were talking about it. Jason made a comment about, how he's not seeing any significant demand trigger. He made a comment that farmers will be making less money this year, and I think the data point that I took out of that was that maps exactly to the lower tractor sales that we're seeing in the new tractor market. So that when you think about are we returning to normal, the answer is we don't really know because there's still this excess capacity in the market, and demand is kind of moving sideways to down. Maybe there'll be some bobbles along the way. I saw yesterday the ATA truckload tonnage index came up for the first time, I think, in year over year, up year over year for the first time in I think 13 months, something like that. So
Hmm.
it's kind of like we're bouncing around on the bottom here. There's no real trigger for demand. Um, some people are holding out that maybe hurricane season will produce some data points that'll or produce some market volatility that'll create some data points to change that narrative. I'm not sure about that, and we really don't want that to happen. So our
No,
thesis,
that's kind of like a good bad scenario, right? Great for the market, really
right?
horrible for people that are in the wake of the devastation, right? So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I was watching Derek. I'm just trying to find the exact wording from his comment. I don't know whether he was at a conference yesterday where he was talking about this. It was reported in Transport News, but he says the market is returning to normal. I really like Derek. I think he's a very astute operator. I met him when he's VP of International at Werner back in maybe 2007. Really smart guy, really good operator. Large public carriers are also, talking about the future of the market, where the market's going, how they see the market. I don't think anybody's got a better finger on the pulse than someone like the CEO of a large truckload carrier. And he made a couple of comments. He said inventories are back to level. The trucking industry has been in a down cycle for nearly 2 years. In fact, and he kind of coined it as capacities has been overshooting demand for that entire period. But he noticed that I'll try and find these exact words. He was seeing more normality in the market. He said this year it's been a much more stable approach in the RFP process. And this is where I think you can probably add some color. There is still some pressure on price, some still pressure price through the process, but much less churn. There's an indication that everybody, both sides, are realizing we're closer to an inflection point. So it's not a great time to go shuffle your deck dramatically in terms of your carrier provider.
mm.
So I thought that was interesting about shuffling the deck. And I guess that's where a lot of shippers have been recently, right? They've been shuffling the deck, looking for a better price, maybe not being as loyal to their incumbents as we would have thought. And maybe it's different
Actually,
by
I
shipper
see it
size.
a bit. I see it a bit as the reverse, Dean. I can tell you through my prospecting, um, when he says they're less likely to shuffle the deck, it matches, actually dovetails directly with what I see, which is a lot of shippers are saying, okay, well, you know what, like price me out on this, let me see that. But there has to be some significant movement for them to move the chess pieces around.
Right.
One of the biggest things, and I've been talking to a lot of sales reps, because immediately when I start hearing things, I start reaching out to my network. I start
Right.
having conversations saying, like, what's happening? What are you seeing? And most of them have come back with the same thing, where it's like, yeah, okay, let's keep the conversation going. But right now, these suppliers were with me during the tough times. I'm trying to keep them happy now during their tough times.
Right.
One thing I can tell you is even with customers that I still work with, we're having conversations weekly, and they're saying, okay, next week, these are customers I used to move 15 loads a week with, and they're
Right.
saying, okay, so next week I got 7 loads. I got 5 suppliers. So I'm going to give you 2, I'm going to give you 2, and the rest of you are going to get 3,
Right.
or 1, right? And like, this is just a constant overlay of the same information. And it seems like it's the same conversations every week,
Right.
which you know what, don't get me wrong. I mean, for all you brokers and 3PLs out there that are listening, obviously you want as much freight from your customers as possible. But I think that we truly have to stop and pay attention to that loyalty piece. Because I think that loyalty piece, and I think the sales reps out there that try and skirt it or try and work your way into the back to get more freight when the customer's trying to be loyal, I think in the end they're going to lose.
Right.
And only just because of, well, a few things. I think a lot of shippers these days, and if you're a shipper out there listening, please give us your comments. I think you care more about the relationships than you ever have.
Right.
That I think is steadfast, and
Right.
hoping those, and I'm going to say some of them believe, but I think the majority of them hope that dedication, and I hope as well, that dedication when things turn, because they will. I mean, listen, Dean, we've talked about the slow market for quite a while now,
Right.
but the reality is everything flips. Like, 2008, 9, 2011 when the economy came back, typically that would be 2021 when things changed. So we had an extra 2 years of like huge growth because of the pandemic. So we're actually like 2 years past that typical decade. Every decade, there's a big bottoming out,
Right.
whether it be housing market, freight market, whatever. It always happens. And that loyalty piece, I truly hope providers for these customers are taking note of that.
Right.
Because when it changes, if all of a sudden you go back and want more, there's going to be problems. Because,
Right.
like, if I look at just even during the pandemic, I had certain carriers that we were dedicated on business, meaning, and not necessarily like contracted rates, like just the customer was like, okay, I'm going to give you all 10 of these a week. And yes, things got a bit tighter, but they got tighter for the carriers that I worked with and dedicated myself to, mainly because the sporadicness of the two-way move, right?
Right.
Maybe it's double the volume going down, single the volume coming home, that kind of thing.
Right.
But rates didn't move that much.
Right.
We allocated for new driver wages. We allocated for a few of the things. But the way we saw rates happening during the pandemic,
Right.
if I was a shipper, I'd be totally turned off. I'd be like, yeah, you guys screwed me, because the majority of people did. And they might say no, but they're lying to themselves. And if they're going to lie about that, I think they'll lie about anything else.
Right.
So I do see shippers in today's day and age wanting to work with fewer, more knowledgeable ones that understand the market better. Like, I truly think today's day and age is the day and age of the professional consultant. Shippers are looking for not just a freight broker, but somebody who can be a consultant to their business. And they might not, and some of them might not want to admit it, because unfortunately, some people think if they need help or training or assistance, it means they're less effective at what they do. But it's not the case. The reality is, you're an expert at what you do. I'm an expert at what I do, which is why when we get together, now we have the expertise of two different places. So shippers are the experts at their product. They're the experts at the allocation of time, energy, resources in their warehouse. They're experts at loading trucks and what the best way to do it is and how to get it done fast. We're the experts at logistics. So if we as the experts don't stay up to par on our field, I think we're losing.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to lose a lot of customers, and I think customers are going to lose faith in us. And it's only a matter of time. I mean, I told you about a couple of stories about reps that I've been speaking to. It's only a matter of time before somebody calls them and intrigues that customer to the point where you get put out of the puzzle.
Yeah. Dan, we've been saying for a while, this is an interesting discussion. Ken made a comment yesterday on the Meet Me for Coffee Freight Market Update, and he said that, it's the summer of bad decisions. He said during this part of the market cycle, people make really bad decisions about where to bid freight, where to price the next 12 months. I'm going to write a blog post about it, because I thought it was an intriguing comment about how in the bottom part of the cycle, you've bid on, you've put an RFP out and you're trying to get it covered as truckload rates are starting to come up, and you're trying to cover those loads with a margin, and the margins just aren't there. And shippers are looking at it thinking, heck, I've probably driven this down as much as I can. There's an inflection point coming. And when someone like Derek Leathers comes out and talks about an inflection point, and we look at rates bottoming out for a period of time and a little bit of seasonality coming back in, and carrier exit rates, carriers still exiting the market, right? So we're still not past where we can say there's a net reduction in capacity in the spot market in particular. We haven't seen that yet, even though we're halfway through August. We're still on track to see the same level of carriers leave the market. We're at, I'm just looking at the numbers here now, we're at 2,000 departures midway through. Last month we had 7,000. So we'll be on par to see the same number of small carriers exit the market because of all the sorts of price pressures. I noticed diesel went up about 7 to 8 cents a gallon this week. So maybe that honeymoon period of decreasing diesel's over, and that'll start to put the squeeze on more carriers as we get into the summer. Diesel prices tend to go up. There's still about 32% of operating costs. So diesel's still a big number, but small fluctuations in diesel can make a big difference. But the sorts of volatility in diesel is interesting. Like went down 7 cents, up 7 cents. Like those sorts of swings in a week translate into big movements at the pump for carriers.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So here we are in, almost at Labor Day, at Memorial Day. We're in the 100 deadly days of summer between Memorial Day and Labor Day. Is it Independence Day? The 100 deadly days of summer is kind of it's 100 deadly days between Memorial and Labor Day. I've got to get that correct. So we're in this weird driving season now where teenage deaths goes through the roof. More people are driving than ever. I don't know if you read the story this week about how many more people are driving. I don't know if you've noticed the surge in traffic. There's a lot more cars on the road at the moment. And there was a story out this week, and I can't remember where. There's a lot more people driving. And it's also construction season on the roads, which means more service failures, more delays, slower average truck speed, more missed appointments. Like this is a summer of, you kind of get a lot of inefficiency over the course of the summer. Truckers feel it more than anybody, largely because of the heat and all of the construction that goes on the roads and all the cascade of delays that causes throughout the entire supply chain.